What if the origin of African spirituality had been erased from history by the Bible itself? What if there existed a deity so powerful, so ancient, so deeply connected to the roots of the African continent, that the sacred scribes themselves preferred to silence his name forever? Today, in this video, you will be confronted with a truth that has been buried for millennia. A mystery that was lost among censored scrolls, colonized cultures, and imposed religions. But now, the truth is resurfacing, and it may shake everything you've ever heard about the divine. Many have heard of Yahweh, the God of Israel, but almost no one asks, why is he the only one who remains? What happened to the other gods? Where are the names, the stories, the sacred cults of the African nations who already worshipped the invisible even before the arrival of the Hebrews? Did spirituality truly begin in the desert, or was it imported, shaped, and protected by hidden interests? There is a name that echoes in the sands of Ethiopia, in the forgotten altars of Nubia, in the ancestral chants of the Congo, and in the legends of the Kush people. A name that once represented a link between heaven and earth. An African god who not only existed, but reigned, was worshipped, revered, and feared. And this god did not disappear. He was erased. But why? What would lead an entire culture to silence a deity so central to its spiritual identity? The answer may shock you, because he represented a power that could not be controlled, tamed, or absorbed by the new monotheistic religions. He was free, he was black, he was African, and that for many was unacceptable. With the advancement of patriarchal religions, the consolidation of Hebrew theology, and the imperial expansion of faith, this god's name was changed, his symbols destroyed, and his priests persecuted. What remained were vestiges, echoes, fragments hidden in disguised rituals, in place names, in secret practices that have withstood the test of time. This video goes beyond the traditional biblical story. Here, we'll delve into the hidden spiritual secrets of the African continent, revealing what has never been taught from pulpits, and revealing chapters ripped from sacred history. You're about to experience the forbidden side of faith. What if what you call idolatry today was actually an older spiritual system, more connected to the essence of creation, and which was deliberately demonized? What if Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, had not simply won, but had rather erased the traces of those who came before him? This isn't just any theory, it's an archaeological, spiritual, and prophetic journey. An investigation that connects African mythologies, apocryphal texts, oral traditions, and evidence that was right before our eyes, but was purposefully rendered invisible. If you ever felt there was something beyond what was taught in the holy books, if you've ever wondered why Africa, the cradle of humanity, has been reduced to spiritual silence, if you've ever had the feeling that there's something hidden between the pages of the Bible, then you need to watch it until the end. Because what will be revealed now can completely transform your view of God, history, and spirituality. But before we talk about who this African god was and how he was erased, we need to understand how it all began. And before we continue with this profound revelation, I want to invite you to reflect with me. This content is not just another YouTube video. It is an attempt to rescue a reconstruction of a spiritual memory that was erased, not by accident, but by force. Therefore, your participation here is essential. If any part of what I've said so far has touched you, provoked you, made you rethink your beliefs, or reminded you of your spiritual roots, then I ask you something simple, but very powerful. Leave a comment below. Tell me what you feel, what you think, what you already knew, or what you're discovering now. I read every comment, and together we can form a community of truth seekers. Silence has been imposed for centuries. But now it's time to break it, and it starts with you, with your voice, with your presence. Oh, and of course, if this topic is important to you, if it awakens something within you, leave a like. because that shows YouTube that this video needs to be shown to more people who, like you, are ready to wake up. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because this is just the first part of a series of revelations that will shake up everything we've been taught about faith, the Bible, and Africa. Are you ready to discover who was the African god that Yahweh wanted to erase? So, let's go back in time. Let's go to the origins. Let's go back to the beginning, to the origins of spirituality. Long before the Bible was written, long before Moses received tablets of stone, long before the name Yahweh was pronounced by any people, there was already clamor on clay altars, chants in tribal languages, smoke rising to the heavens toward deities born from the womb of Africa, because it was there, in the heart of the African continent, that human beings began to lift their eyes to the invisible and seek connection with the eternal. When we think of the Bible, we usually imagine Israel, the desert, Jerusalem, the Hebrews, but almost no one realizes how Africa is present throughout the biblical narrative. From Genesis to Revelation, the African presence is constant, yet often ignored, minimized, or spiritualized to the point of becoming unrecognizable. And this is no accident. The Nile River, for example, is one of the central settings of the Old Testament. It's there that Moses is placed in a basket. It's in Egypt that Joseph becomes governor. It's in the land of Cush that prophets take refuge. And who was Cush? Who was Mitzrayim? Both sons of Ham, the direct ancestor of the African peoples. The Bible repeatedly mentions names like Ethiopia, Saba, Egypt, and Libya, African territories that feature prominently in profound spiritual contexts. But note, these peoples are never treated as possessing a legitimate spirituality. On the contrary, they are almost always presented as threats, as heretics, as pagan nations. And this raises a dangerous question. Was the goal truly to tell the truth, or to shape it around a narrative that favors only one side of the story? The spiritual geography of the Bible doesn't begin in Israel. It begins in Africa. When the Bible says that the Garden of Eden had rivers that spread through regions like Havilah, Gihon, and the land of Cush, it's pointing south to the black roots of civilization. But why haven't we been taught this clearly? Why can't Africa, the cradle of humanity, also be recognized as the cradle of spirituality? The answer may lie precisely in the deities that existed there before the emergence of Yahweh. Indeed, before Hebrew monotheism consolidated the exclusive worship of the God of Israel, the African peoples already worshipped their own gods. And these gods were powerful, revered, and feared. They had their own moral codes, their own purification rituals, their own creation myths, and an intense relationship with the cycles of nature and the spirits of their ancestors. The sacred was not distant. It inhabited the forest, the river, the thunder, the earth, and even the bodies of the priests. We are experiencing an extremely difficult era in which the prophecies are being scored, but many still do not realize what is happening in the world. This is why I made my digital book available, To Reveal the Apocalypse, which you can download immediately through the first comment set. This book will help you discover all the mysteries of the apocalypse and transform your life. Access the first comment set to get your copy, because very few remain and will soon be withdrawn. Don't waste time, click now and make sure your digital copy. Deities like Amma, Nzambi, Olodumare, Wak, Mawu, and others were not mere tribal inventions. They were the heart of the faith of hundreds of civilizations. They were the symbol of an organic spirituality, connected to real life, to the body, to death, to rebirth. A spirituality that needed no stone temples or written codes. The drum, the fire, and the spirit were enough to make the invisible present. But as the Hebrew people established themselves as a monotheistic nation, these African gods became a theological threat, because it wasn't just about faith, it was about control. If the people were to find the divine on their own, outside the boundaries imposed by prophets and scribes, how could they maintain centralized power? How could they prevent plurality? How could they control the narrative? This is why we see so many biblical texts condemning foreign gods. It's not because they were false, but because they were dangerous. Dangerous in the sense that they challenge the monopoly of the sacred. When the Old Testament speaks of the gods of the Egyptians, the idols of Canaan, and the pagan sacrifices, it is, in fact, demonizing entire cultures that already had advanced and independent spiritual systems. And we mustn't forget that the Hebrews were raised in Egypt. There they grew, learned, absorbed, and also reacted. And don't forget to get your digital book, Reveal the Apocalypse. It is very important that you buy it quickly before the copies run out. Yahweh didn't emerge from nowhere. He revealed himself within a context in which several other gods were already worshipped, including by their own ancestors. And here comes the tricky part. Yahweh not only presents himself as the true God, he demands absolute exclusivity. You shall have no other gods before me. This is one of the first commands of the 10 Commandments. And why such urgency to erase the others? Why wasn't it enough to simply exist? Did the others need to be destroyed, forgotten, erased? This leads us to the hypothesis this video seeks to explore. Was there an African god so influential, so present, so real, that Yahweh had to remain silent? Was there a spiritual struggle behind the scenes of sacred history, a war of narratives where only one side has survived in the records that have come down to us? Everything indicates that it does. And that's why we're here, to open our eyes, to dust off forgotten texts, to remember what was buried. Because by understanding Africa's role in biblical history, we also come to better understand why this silence was necessary and who it protected. But this isn't just a historical analysis, it's a reconnection with our spiritual essence. It's the breaking of a collective spell that has made millions of people believe their roots are inferior, their gods false, their spirituality primitive. And all of this is based on a theology shaped by vested interests, wars, and a lot of politics. So, what do you think of all this so far? Did you already know that the name Cush appears dozens of times in the Bible? Have you ever stopped to consider that the Hebrew god emerged amidst an ocean of other already established deities? Have you heard of Amma, Nzambi, Olodumare? Tell me in the comments which of these names you already knew, or if you're hearing this for the first time. And if something you've heard so far has truly impacted you, comment below. The silence is being broken, so I know you're with me on this journey. Let's continue. The burning question is this: who was this African god who needed to be erased? What was the name that provoked so much discomfort, so much rejection, to the point of disappearing from the official memory of biblical history? A name that didn't fit on the tablets of stone, that didn't bend to the patriarchal structure of the Hebrews, a name that resisted echoing through ancestral chants, even under the oppression of swords, dogmas, and crosses. This god had many forms, many faces, many names, because African spirituality was never confined to a single model of divinity. It was alive, fluid, connected to the elements of creation, but among so many names, there is one that stands out in various cultures across the continent: Amma. For the Dogons of Mali, Amma is the supreme creator of the universe. He is not a simple cosmic force or a distant god. He is the principle that organizes chaos, that shapes matter, that breathes life. He is represented as a dual being, simultaneously masculine and feminine, which in itself undermines the logic of the exclusively masculine god of Hebrew tradition. Amma is balance, cycle, and totality. In his hands lies the order of the stars, the harmony of plants, and the destiny of humanity. For the ancients, Amma did not need to be feared. He needed to be understood. And this was perhaps his greatest mistake in the eyes of religious rulers, being an accessible, intimate God revealed in nature itself. While Yahweh reveals himself in the thunder of Mount Sinai and demands absolute reverence under penalty of death, Amma manifests herself in the breath of the forest, the whisper of the wind, the rhythm of the rain falling on the corn. There was no need for monumental temples, animal sacrifices, or hereditary priesthoods to access Amma. It was enough to be in communion with life. This is radically opposed to Old Testament theology, where access to the divine is restricted, mediated, and hierarchical. And don't think that Amma was an isolated figure. Among other African peoples, he takes on different names. Nzambi among the Bantu, Olodumare in the Yoruba worldview, Wak for the peoples of the Horn of Africa. In all these cases, what recurs is the archetype of a god who creates through harmony, who is present in all things, and who presents himself not as exclusivist, but as integrator. Instead of destroying other gods, he incorporates them. Instead of waging war against other spiritual cultures, he communicates through them. This is living spirituality, and this is what has been erased. The Bible never mentions these names directly, but it's impossible not to notice the similarities between some descriptions of Yahweh and these African deities. Many independent scholars suggest a profound cultural influence between African gods and the formation of Hebrew monotheism. After all, the biblical patriarchs did not emerge in a spiritual vacuum. They lived in a world already saturated with rituals, symbols, entities, and mysteries. Abraham, for example, came from Mesopotamia, but according to some African oral traditions, part of his lineage passed through Ethiopia. Moses was raised in Egypt, surrounded by one of the most advanced spiritualities of the ancient world. Interestingly, in the account of the burning bush, Yahweh reveals his name as I Am, a highly philosophical and symbolic concept, similar to the idea of a universal life force present in African ancestral cults. The undeclared syncretism between Yahweh and African deities is an important clue that something was incorporated, adapted, and reinterpreted. And this is not just a hypothesis. There are archaeological remains, ancient inscriptions, founding myths, and oral traditions that point to the existence of an African theology that long predates the Hebrew tradition. In some West African villages, elders tell stories about a creator god who was betrayed, forgotten, or abandoned by mankind. Stories that recall, with striking similarity, the narratives of fall and separation found in the Bible. What changes is the perspective. While in Scripture, humanity's separation is the fault of disobedience, in African traditions, separation is the result of the arrogance of men who attempted to dominate the divine. And perhaps that's why Amma's name, and so many others, was banished from official history, because they carry a wisdom that doesn't fit the mold of religious control. They are too free, too human, too natural, and therefore dangerous to those who wanted to centralize spiritual power in Jerusalem under the orders of Yahweh, the God of hosts. Here, it's important to remember, the African gods were not defeated, they were silenced. But how do you silence a spiritual force so deeply rooted in the heart of a people? How do you erase thousands of years of oral tradition? How do you hide symbols engraved on stones, textiles, drums, and dances? The answer lies in religious imposition, in the extermination of priests, in the demonization of ancestral rites, in the label of paganism plastered on everything that refused to bow before the new dominant faith. And so over time, the name of Amma and her ilk became a whisper, then a legend, then nothing, until now. Because now we are lifting the veil. Now we are recovering memory. Now we are remembering that before Moses ascended Sinai, someone was already speaking to God in the mountains of Ethiopia. That before David built the temple, someone was already dancing in honor of the sacred in the savannas of Zimbabwe. That before the Bible was written, African spirituality was already being passed down from generation to generation, not with ink and parchment, but with rhythm, breath, and presence. And if you're feeling something inside, you awaken. If these words are doing more than just informing, if they're touching memories you might not even be able to explain, then tell me in the comments. Have you ever heard of Amma? Leave his name below. It could be just that, Amma. Or if you want to go further, write, Africa also has its revelation. This will show me that you're with me on this quest, and it will help the algorithm understand that this topic needs to be spread. We continue. Now that the name of Amma and so many other African deities has been brought to light, we must face an inevitable question. If these gods existed, were worshipped, respected, and recognized as divine by entire civilizations, why don't their names appear clearly in the Holy Scriptures? Why is there silence, or rather, is it really just silence? Or are we facing a much deeper and more disturbing case, an intentional, deliberate, precisely engineered erasure? This kind of question may bother those accustomed to the Bible as the only valid spiritual book. But the truth is that even within the biblical tradition itself, there are signs that something has been removed, reinterpreted, or simply hidden. Just look closely. Why are there books mentioned in the Bible itself that aren't in the Bible? Why are there passages that refer to other writings, other sources, other accounts, and these texts simply no longer with us? A clear example is the book of Jasher, mentioned in Joshua 10:13 and 2 Samuel 1:18. This book was a collection of sacred stories, war songs, and memories of the people. But it disappeared. It was never canonized. Why? The same is true of the Book of the Wars of the Lord, mentioned in Numbers 21:14. This document, according to the biblical text, contained information about battles, strategies, and perhaps even the gods of the peoples the Hebrews faced. But it too disappeared. When we put this into perspective, what seems like a technical detail begins to take on much more serious dimensions. We're talking about a process of selecting what would be kept and what would be discarded. And those who make this selection also decide what will be remembered and what will be forgotten. But the oblivion, in this case, was no historical accident. It was by design. Over the centuries, the formation of the biblical canon underwent countless power struggles, both spiritual and political. Conciliations, councils, imperial edicts, and decisions by religious leaders shaped what we now know as the Bible. This means that much was left out, and anything left out of a sacred book loses its legitimacy in the eyes of the majority. Even if it is true, even if it carries profound revelations, even if it represents the voice of an entire people. Among the texts that were left out, the so-called apocryphal or pseudepigraphical books hold true spiritual gems. Writings such as the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Book of Adam and Eve, the Ascension of Isaiah, the Apocalypse of Abraham, all these documents, though excluded from the official canon, speak of fallen angels, ancient gods, and spiritual orders before the creation of Israel. They present a more plural, mystical, and open vision of spirituality. In many of these texts, one perceives that spiritual reality was composed of multiple celestial beings, divine hierarchies, and ancestral entities. A structure much closer to African cosmologies than to the rigid monotheism imposed later. But if there was such a wealth of spiritual vision, why was it hidden? The answer is painful, because this plurality threatened the central control of faith. If each people could have a legitimate path to the divine, if African gods were real, if contact with the spiritual did not depend on a specific temple or priestly lineage, what would happen to the power of those who centralized faith in the name of a single God? Consider what the Old Testament itself reveals. In Exodus 23:13, the people are instructed not to pronounce the names of other gods. In Deuteronomy 12:2-3, there is a command to completely destroy the places where other nations worship their gods, altars, sacred poles, carved images. In other words, it wasn't just a matter of rejecting, it was necessary to erase. And this erasure wasn't limited to destroying physical objects. It extended to memory, to language, to names. And here's where an even more shocking detail comes in. The name Yahweh, which today is treated with absolute reverence, was also shrouded in mystery, censorship, and substitution. For centuries, even Jewish scribes stopped pronouncing the original name, replacing it with Adonai or Elohim. But why hide a name that, according to tradition, represents the true God? What if this process of concealment wasn't an isolated event? What if this pattern of hiding, replacing, and resignifying sacred names was used before against the names of African deities? Replacing names is one of the most effective forms of spiritual erasure, because names carry power, they carry identity, they carry memory. When you forbid a people from speaking the name of their God, you're not just censoring a word. You're trying to erase the very soul of that people. This type of spiritual violence became public policy in several empires. In Egypt, priests of ancient deities were killed when new dynasties took power. In Babylon, images and records of vanquished gods were systematically erased. In the Roman Empire, religions that challenged hegemony were suppressed, and their temples were transformed. History repeats itself. Whenever religious power combines with political power, spirituality becomes a tool of domination. And in the case of African traditions, this was done with particular cruelty, because it wasn't enough to simply remove the names from the books. It was necessary to declare that these gods were false, that they were demons, that their followers were damned. It was necessary to invert the meanings, transform the drum into a threat, the dance into possession, the ancestral priest into a sorcerer. And so, little by little, African spirituality became synonymous with danger, with heresy, with sin. But this narrative wasn't just written in books, it was tattooed on the minds of generations. How many people today carry a deep fear of approaching their own spiritual roots? How many are ashamed to ask about their grandparents' rituals? How many have heard their entire lives that the sacred inhabits only one place, the temple, and one name, Yahweh, and that anything outside of this is darkness? This is the legacy of silencing. A silencing that begins in Scripture and spreads throughout history, through churches, schools, and families. And that can only be broken with courage, with memory, with voice, with searching. So, if you've come this far feeling like something was stolen from you, the right to know, to feel, to reconnect, then write in the comments below, "I want back what was taken from me." And if this revelation sparked something within you, share what struck you most. Was it the names of the apocryphal books? Was it the way the other gods were silenced? Or was it the fact that even Yahweh's name was hidden for a time? Write it down below. Choose a phrase that represents you, or simply say, "The erasure ends here. This way I'll know you're with me on this journey of spiritual rescue." Let's continue. Based on everything we've revealed so far, we now delve into a part of the journey where the shadows begin to shift and spiritual conflict becomes inevitable. Because once the existence of African deities is recognized, once their names resonate among us, we must face the confrontation that has been brewing over the centuries. The clash between the centralizing God of Hebrew monotheism, Yahweh, and the deities that represented the spiritual roots of ancient African civilizations, such as Amma, Olodumare, Nzambi, and so many others. This was not just a conflict between beliefs, but between worlds. And the traces of this confrontation still mark the spiritual unconscious of millions of people to this day. Hebrew monotheism emerged with a very clear mission: to unify the faith of a people around a single name, a single law, a single spiritual throne. And for this single God to establish himself as absolute, everything else had to be discredited, discarded, classified as idolatry, superstition, or spiritual rebellion. And here comes a question that almost no one dares to touch. Did Yahweh's ascension as the one true God happen solely by revelation, or also by strategy? When the Hebrews established themselves as a people, surrounded by nations with their own deities, they not only presented Yahweh as superior, they imposed their exclusivity. There was no room for coexistence. The order was clear: destroy altars, tear down sacred poles, eliminate priests and prophets of other traditions. What we see in the Old Testament texts is not simply a defense of faith. It is a policy of exclusion, a spiritual decree of cultural elimination. And this is where the confrontation becomes more pronounced. While the Hebrew God demanded exclusive worship, absolute fear, and unconditional obedience to laws established by himself, the African gods took a different path. Amma, for example, did not command blind submission. His presence was felt in the harmony between the cycles of nature, in the ancestral wisdom transmitted orally, in the balance between masculine and feminine, heaven and earth, spirit and body. Olodumare, in the Yoruba worldview, is a god who acts through the orishas, entities that express different aspects of creation. Nzambi is understood as a vital principle that permeates all living things, not as an isolated being in the sky issuing orders. Notice how the structures differ. Yahweh is a centralizer, a lawgiver, a warrior. His relationship with his people is based on covenant and obedience. He promises protection in exchange for absolute fidelity. African gods, if we can truly call them that, as many of them are not gods in the Western sense, reveal themselves through ancestry, daily life, dance, planting, birth, healing, and death. They don't demand exclusivity because they know that spirituality is a living network, not an isolated throne. This is radically opposed to what Hebrew monotheism taught. And this opposition wasn't just theoretical, it was real, political, and often bloody. The Hebrews saw in other gods not only spiritual falsehoods, but also threats to the stability of national identity. By keeping other gods alive, they also maintained the possibility of other paths, other laws, other ways of connecting with the divine. And this, for a theology based on exclusivity, was extremely dangerous. Therefore, the commandment, "You shall have no other gods before me," is not just a religious phrase. It is a sentence against the entire previous spiritual system, including those deeply rooted in African cultures. Now consider with me a delicate and often overlooked point. Many of the attributes attributed to Yahweh over time already existed in African spiritual traditions. The idea of a God who created heaven and earth? It was already present in Amma. The belief in a supreme force that communicates through natural manifestations. It was already practiced by countless African ethnic groups. The notion of a spirit breathing life into man. It was present in the myths of the Akan people, the Dogon, and the Zulu. The spiritual structure presented in the Bible did not emerge in a vacuum. It does, indeed, engage with the African spiritual environment, even if it later attempted to erase this origin. And this is where the conflict becomes even deeper. Because what was done was not just to deny the African gods, but to steal their attributes, to clothe Yahweh with his qualities, and then point back and say, it was all a lie. Imagine growing up hearing that everything your ancestors believed was an illusion, that the spirituality that sustained your village was the work of deception, and that now you must bow before a single name, a single book, a single temple. This is not just religious imposition, it is colonization of the soul. And yet, the similarities between the descriptions of Yahweh and the archetypes of African deities are striking. Yahweh is presented as a consuming fire, but also as a gentle wind. as the one who kills but also heals, as the one who parts the waters, who controls thunder, who speaks in the silence. All these elements have been present in African myths for centuries. What has changed is the guise, the narrative, the master of the discourse. And at this point, you might be wondering, is Yahweh just a copy of the African gods? No, that's not the point. The point is that there was, indeed, an appropriation of symbols, ideas, and archetypes that belonged to a previous spirituality, and this appropriation was used to build a new structure, but based on the negation of everything that came before. This is what makes the conflict so violent. It's not just about disagreement, but about nullification. Hebrew monotheism doesn't debate with the African gods. It annihilates them, curses them, transforms them into demons. This stance resonates to this day. Just look at how many churches treat any reference to African spiritual traditions. There's no dialogue, there's fear, rejection, demonization. But does this fear stem from a real confrontation with evil, or from an unconscious legacy of a millennia-old theological conflict, where everything plural, circular, communal, and ancestral needed to be destroyed so that the throne of the one God could remain untouched? What if it's true that these traditions still hold fragments of a wisdom that predates Yahweh himself? What if, by denying them, we're denying essential parts of our own spiritual identity? That's why this conversation needs to continue. That's why this video needs to exist. Because only those who know what has been erased can choose what they will remember. If any part of this reflection touched you, if you felt we're saying something out loud that has long needed to be said, leave a comment below. Spirituality cannot be colonized. Or if you want to go even deeper, write, Yahweh is not the first nor the only one. This isn't a provocation, it's a wake-up call. Let's move forward. And even with centuries of persecution, erasure, and demonization, African ancestry has not been completely silenced. The spirituality of the peoples of Africa subsists not only through the faith that persists in the invisible, but also through the visible marks that have survived the test of time. Marks engraved in stone, drawn on fabrics, chanted around the fire, whispered in the ears of the initiated. Because no matter how hard they tried to silence the ancient gods, the evidence never completely disappeared. It simply changed location. It left the temples and entered the body, escaped from books and hid in stories, left the hands of kings and passed into the care of elders and midwives, griots and holy mothers, healers and guardians of time. This lost, or rather hidden evidence is everywhere, waiting for attentive eyes. It's found in the symbols repeated in sculptures and masks, in the geometric designs engraved on village walls, in the statues that remain standing even after invasions, wars, and forced conversions. And what's most striking is how these symbolic manifestations maintain coherence with each other, even in different parts of the African continent, even separated by vast distances and linguistic barriers. It's as if they speak the same spiritual language, a language that predates writing, predates borders. Let's consider, for example, the traditions of the Dogon people of Mali. They carry with them one of the most complex cosmological systems of the ancient world. According to their myths, the universe was created by Amma, and the celestial order is sustained by rhythms that manifest themselves in the stars and in human rituals. Most impressively, long before modern science proved the existence of the star Sirius B, a star invisible to the naked eye, the Dogon were already talking about it. How did they know this? How did they accurately describe a celestial body that would only be identified centuries later with powerful telescopes? Was it coincidence? Or was it the result of a spirituality deeply connected to the universe, capable of accessing knowledge through pathways that science still doesn't understand? Another example comes from the region of Ethiopia, the birthplace of one of the world's oldest spiritual traditions, even recognized in scripture. There, Christianity arrived early, but it did not arrive alone. It found fertile soil, replete with symbols, myths, and practices that engaged with the divine long before the arrival of the cross. Biblical Ethiopia, often associated with the land of Cush, has always been treated in Scripture as an enigmatic, powerful, and yet shunned place. The prophet Isaiah, in his oracles, mentions the land of Cush as the people of lofty stature, of shining skin, feared from afar. Why this simultaneous reverence and fear? What was there that so troubled the central Hebrew narrative? Historical records reveal that the Aksum Empire, located in the region of present-day Ethiopia and Eritrea, was a spiritual and cultural powerhouse. It possessed its own scripture, its own monumental architecture, and a belief system that integrated cosmic, solar, and lunar elements into a profoundly symbolic worldview. The stones of churches carved into the mountains, such as those in Lalibela, speak of a people who saw the sacred in rock, in the earth, in a direct connection with the high and the low. Inscriptions in Ge'ez, Ethiopia's sacred language, still bear references that dialogue with pre-biblical names and symbols, but these were, over time, absorbed by institutionalized Christianity. Already in Egypt, the African spiritual heritage reached perhaps its most elaborate and systematized form. We're not just talking about pyramids and pharaohs, but a worldview that structured all life around the principle of Ma'at, order, balance, truth. Gods like Ra, Osiris, Isis, Anubis, and Thoth represented not just mythological figures, but universal forces that acted in human daily life. What's most fascinating is how the narrative of Osiris, the dying and resurrecting god, resembles in many ways other figures from later religions, including Christ himself. Could this be a coincidence? Or an echo of an earlier truth being retold in new words? And even outside these great empires, there is evidence everywhere. The fertility figurines in Bantu territories, the Adinkra symbols in Ghana, each with a philosophical and spiritual meaning. The designs on kente cloth, the masks of the Fang and Bol people charged with ritualistic energy. The way names are given in villages, always connecting the child to a cosmic event, an ancestor, or a blessing. Every detail, every color, every sound is spiritual, and none of this is by chance. But the most moving thing of all is realizing how many of these elements survived hidden, even after centuries of persecution. During slavery, for example, Africans forcibly transported to the Americas hid their orishas behind Catholic saints. They hid their strengths in their work songs. They hid their rituals in backyards, in religious temples, in popular festivals. African spirituality disguised itself to avoid dying. It survived because it was too genuine to be extinguished. And now that we're beginning to see these clues, it's impossible to ignore them. They're in the names of places, in the customs we've inherited without realizing it, in the expressions we use without even knowing where they came from. They're in the force with which some words vibrate within us. They're in the shiver we feel when we hear a drum. They're in the unexplained terror that falls upon hearing an ancient story. Do you feel it? Because if you've made it this far, chances are something inside is awakening. Some ancient memory, some calling that may have been stifled by years of doctrine, fear, guilt, shame. But now it's there, begging to be heard. And if all this resonates with you, I invite you to leave a comment below. Write, "Ancestry is alive." Or if you'd like, tell us if you've seen or heard any symbol, story, or art linked to African spirituality that has resonated with you. Let's transform this space in the comments into a sacred space for recovery, sharing, and connection. Because what has endured until today now needs to be remembered. Let's move on. And if the evidence has endured for so long, even in silence, even hidden in the shadows of history, it's because there was a counterforce working intensely to prevent any of this from coming to light. And this force, unfortunately, didn't come solely from the Hebrew biblical narrative. It intensified with the arrival of European Christianity, which not only reinterpreted the sacred texts, but also used them as a spiritual weapon to invade territories, subdue cultures, and erase the faith of African peoples in the name of supposed salvation. It must be stated clearly, the colonization of Africa was not merely political or economic, it was profoundly spiritual. The European armies that landed on the African continent did not come alone. Alongside the soldiers were priests, missionaries, monks, and theologians. They carried not only weapons, but crucifixes. They carried not only gunpowder, but also the Bible. And they did not enter only villages, they entered souls. They entered with promises of heaven and threats of hell, with promises of civilization and the destruction of all that did not bow to the Western model of faith. The so-called civilizing missions were, in fact, spiritual cleansing operations. Their main objective was to eradicate African cults, destroy ancestral worldviews, and replace the entire ancient spiritual structure with an imported, European, white, patriarchal, centralizing religion. It was in this process that ancient gods were demonized, sacred rituals were classified as witchcraft, African symbols were burned or confiscated, and drums were forcibly silenced. What had once been a channel of connection with the divine came to be seen as the work of the devil. But which devil? Their devil. Because for the European colonizer, Africans never had a legitimate spirituality. Their knowledge was ignorance. Their faith was superstition. Their connection with the invisible was seen as demonic possession. And so, everything had to be replaced. Oracles were replaced by catechisms. The names of the gods were replaced by the names of saints. Ancestors were forgotten, rituals were forbidden, festivals were emptied. And all this was done in the name of a God of love, but one that always arrived accompanied by pain, oppression, hierarchy, and punishment. The most perverse thing is that this spiritual substitution wasn't optional. It was imposed as a condition of belonging. Only those who were baptized could study. Only those who followed the sacraments could marry. Only those who knelt before the new altar could have dignity. And little by little, colonization created a deep wound in the soul of the African people, the wound of denial. Because it wasn't enough to change religion, it was necessary to deny everything that came before. Deny your grandfather's name, your grandmother's dance, the medicine man's herb, the creation myth told on nights of the full moon. African spirituality was being replaced by cold dogmas, imposed doctrines, and theologies that had no connection with the land, the body, or real life. Africans were taught to seek the sacred outside themselves, outside their villages, outside their people. They were taught that God lived far away, in a distant heaven, and that only through a white European intermediary, dressed in a robe and carrying a cross, could they access salvation. And so thousands of years of direct connection with the divine were exchanged for mechanical, memorized, soulless rituals. And what remained of all this was a generation that learned to distrust itself. It learned that its color was a curse, that its faith was sin, that its sound was noise, that its medicine was witchcraft, and most cruelly, it learned to love the one who enslaved it and to hate its own ancestors. European spiritual domination was so effective that many began to consider erasure as liberation. They began to call liberation what had been a slavery of the soul. This is the power of dogma when it disguises itself as gospel. But still, something persisted. Because African spiritual roots run deep, no matter how many branches they cut, the trunk remained standing. The memory of Amma, of Olodumare, of Nzambi, of Mawu, it didn't disappear. It remained there, dormant, waiting for the right time to awaken. It remained in lullabies, in the stories told by elders, in the body movements during celebratory dances. It remained in the eyes that closed to listen to the earth, in the bare feet that knew the way without a map, in the hands that knew how to heal without a diploma. And now, in this time when the world cries out for reconnection, when religious structures are crumbling and people are seeking answers outside the institutions that promised so much and delivered so little, it is ancestral spirituality that calls again. Because it never lied, it never promised heaven as an escape. It always pointed to the earth as a place of fulfillment. Religious and colonizing intervention may have erased the names, but it could not erase the presence. Because the African divine does not need to be defended, it only needs to be remembered. And this remembrance is happening now. It's in this video. It's in your listening. It's in your thirst to know more. You who are here, watching until this moment, you are part of the awakening, part of the recovery, part of the healing process. Because reclaiming the spirituality of our ancestors is not a return to the past. It's a leap toward our true spiritual identity. If this all resonates with you, if these words somehow touch something that was dormant inside you, comment below. Colonization didn't defeat my faith. Or if you'd like, share what impacted you most in this passage. Was it what the missionaries did? Was it the replacement of rituals? Or was it the fact that so many people still believe there's only one valid way to connect with the sacred? Right here. This helps the video reach more people, but most importantly, it helps us build a chain of consciousness, memory, and reconnection. Let's continue. And even after everything that has been done to erase, silence, and distort African spirituality, what we see now before our eyes is something that seemed impossible just a few decades ago. A return, a rebirth, a reconnection with our roots. It's as if the spirit of our ancestors is finally piercing the veil of history to call us back, calling firmly, but also tenderly, not with guilt, but with acceptance, because the time for redemption has come. Today, more and more Black people, and not just Black people, are rising up to look back with free eyes. They are discovering that before they were taught to fear, they knew how to dance. Before they learned to obey, they knew how to connect. Before they were converted, they were conscious. And it is this ancestral consciousness that is returning with force, breaking mental shackles, untying the knots of fear, illuminating paths that have been closed for centuries. This phenomenon is so powerful, so profound, that it can no longer be ignored. We are talking about an African spiritual renaissance that spans continents. It appears in books, in songs, in conversation circles, on social media, in collectives, in universities, in toreros, in Black churches, in spaces of healing and reconnection. People are returning to their own feet, to their own voice, to their own spirituality. Not because they reject God, but because they are discovering that God never rejected them. One of the most striking manifestations of this return has been the growth of biblical Afrocentrism, a movement that seeks to reinterpret Scripture based on African experience, geography, culture, and memory. It's a movement that asks, what if the protagonists of the Bible were mostly Black? What if the faith we were taught was merely a distorted reinterpretation of something that had existed on the African continent for millennia? What if the true promised land wasn't across the sea, but right here beneath our feet, where the footprints of our ancestors tread? These questions are shaking things up. They're challenging traditional perspectives, reconstructing theologies, restoring dignity to those who were taught to see themselves as inferior even before God. This is where Black theology comes in powerfully, not as opposition to Christianity, but as a way to free Christianity from colonialism, a way of saying we too are the image and likeness of the divine. Our bodies are also sacred. Our drums are also prayer. Our stories are also revelation. Black theologians like James Cone, Black women like Renita Weems, leaders like Albert Klieg, and other prominent figures who resonate in spiritual liberation spaces are rising up to reinterpret the Gospels from an African lens. revealing that the God who liberated the people from Egypt never intended to enslave others in the process. African spirituality, which has always been about communion, sharing, and reconnection with the whole, is finding new ways to express itself without denying its origins, but also without being bound by the shackles of the past. And alongside this intellectual and theological movement, there are also community spiritual leaders who are taking their place with courage and awareness. They are not just pastors or priests, but guardians of knowledge, storytellers, griots, spiritual mothers, decolonial therapists, and masters of tradition. They are spread throughout the peripheries, villages, universities, quilombos, and even within churches that no longer fit within the old structure. They are calling people back to the drum, to the body, to the time of silence and listening, calling inward, into oneself, into the truth. This return to spiritual roots is also a return to the body, because the faith we were taught was a faith of denial of the body, of punishment of the flesh, of fear of pleasure. African spirituality, on the other hand, has always understood the body as a living temple, as an expression of the sacred, as a channel for the manifestation of ancestry. Dancing is not a sin. Drumming is not a sin. Shouting, laughing, singing, crying, all of this is prayer. All of this is a celebration of life as a divine gift. And now people are rediscovering this, and they are rediscovering themselves in the process. And it's not just about religious practices, but about an everyday spirituality, integrated with life, with the land, with the community. A spirituality that doesn't need a pulpit to be legitimate, nor a suit jacket to be heard. That doesn't need institutional endorsement to be true. That doesn't need to deny one's own color, one's own hair, one's own history. This spirituality has roots, and these roots are now being watered, cared for, and strengthened, because there's an entire generation that has decided it will no longer be lost. And this generation is here. It's in you. It's in every person who has reached this point in the video. Because if you're listening to all of this and something inside you is awakening, then you're already part of this change. You're a witness and part of the movement. You're a link in the chain of reconnection that is once again connecting the present to the past, the head to the heart, the human to the divine. You are heir to a wisdom that has survived everything. And now it's returning. If this resonates within you, if you felt something calling your name during this talk, leave a comment. I'm returning to my roots. Or write, my faith has color, history, ancestry. Share what you're feeling. This is more than a video, it's a sacred space for reconnection. The more people comment, the more people feel, the more people awaken. Let's move on. Now that you've felt the call, that you've walked with me the paths of spiritual memory, that you've seen how symbols resisted, how bodies danced even in chains, how the African soul survived under oppression, there's a question that needs to be asked. A question that burns like fire and burns like a drum beating in the chest. Why was all this hidden from you? Have you ever really asked yourself that? Since childhood, you were taught to pray in a specific way, to think of God in a specific way, to imagine the sky as something distant, blue, European, to always see images of the sacred with clear faces, fine features, soft voices, straight hair, delicate hands. You were taught to distrust your own skin, your own music, your own smell, your own dance. You were taught that the divine was clean, pure, white, and that everything that resembled you needed to be sanctified or silenced. And this was no accident. What we're talking about here isn't just spirituality, but an erasure engineering that shaped minds, reprogrammed hearts, and hijacked the souls of millions of people. And this didn't happen overnight. It was a process, a project, an indoctrination carried out patiently, precisely, with symbolic and real violence, and most seriously, carried out in the name of God. They hid this from you because they knew that if you knew the truth, you would never accept the condition of spiritual inferiority. You would never accept seeing your people described only as descendants of a curse, as bearers of sin, as targets for the salvation of others. If you knew that your ancestors already conversed with the divine even before the Bible was written, you would never bow before an altar that denies your essence. You would demand respect. You would demand truth. You would demand the right to be whole. Spiritual ignorance was a tool of control. Keeping you away from your origins was a way to keep you dependent, obedient, and guilty. Because a person who doesn't know their spiritual roots lives in search of external approval. They live trying to fit in. They live asking for permission to exist. And such a person is easy to control, easy to manipulate, easy to exploit. Now think, who benefits from this silence? Who benefits from keeping you separated from your ancestry? Who benefits when you reject the power that runs in your blood? Who is strengthened when you believe your spirituality needs to be authorized by someone outside? Behind this silence lies power, political power, economic power, religious power. Entire structures feed on your disconnection. Empires are built on your lack of identity. Theologies only make sense when you don't understand that your ancestors weren't lost. They were silenced. And that the faith you've learned to follow, more often than not, was built on the destruction of your own. And the most painful thing is that this strategy was so effective that many of our own brothers and sisters became advocates of erasure. Because the system is so perverse that when you begin to awaken, the first resistance comes from within the home. It comes from family. It comes from church. It comes from voices still trapped in the narrative of fear. Don't mess with that. That's the enemy's work. Leave it alone. But what they call that is you. It's your root, your origin, your direct connection to the sacred. There's no way to leave it alone, because it's what sustains you. Do you think they hid all this out of pity, by chance? Out of distraction? Of course not. They hid it because they knew that a people without a spiritual connection to their ancestors are a people without ground. And a people without ground kneels easily, gives up easily, gets lost easily. Now, do you understand why they hid all this from you? Because if you know, you free yourself. If you know, you stop asking for permission to be who you are. If you know, you stop repeating speeches that take you away from your essence. If you know, you start to hear the ancient voices, the voices that never went away, the voices that keep whispering in your dreams, in the unexplained pain, in the chills that come out of nowhere, in the songs that touch you deeply and make you cry even without understanding why. These voices are no coincidence. They are your inheritance. They are calling. And now that you've heard, there's no longer any way to pretend you don't know. That's why so many people fear this kind of content, because it doesn't inform, it transforms. It doesn't just teach, it awakens, and awakening hurts. Because you begin to see that what seemed like faith was actually fear, that what was called salvation was often submission, and that what you were taught to call true spirituality actually distanced you from your own truth. But don't blame yourself. You're not alone. You weren't the only one deceived. Millions of people are waking up now, and you're part of this generation that no longer accepts living in spiritual ignorance, that no longer accepts being a spectator in its own story, that no longer accepts loving God at the cost of hating itself. Now that you know, what are you going to do with it? You don't have to answer now. But if this touched something deep inside you, if this question echoes like thunder in your mind, comment here, I want to know who I am spiritually. Or else, the truth is setting me free. Write. Share what you felt. This exchange in the comments is part of the process. It's part of the reconnection ritual. The more people share their discoveries, the more others will feel safe doing the same. Let's break the silence together. Let's continue. If you've made it this far, it's because something inside you refused to remain asleep. And I tell you with absolute certainty, it was no accident. Your spirit heard the call. Your ancestry has manifested. And now that the truth has touched your heart, there's no turning back. The path to reconnection is open and you are no longer alone. So if this video has awakened you, subscribe to the channel now, because here we will continue unearthing the roots, uncovering the silences, and giving voice to what they tried to erase. The next video is already waiting for you there on the screen, and in it we will continue this profound journey. But first, leave a like, because it shows YouTube that this message needs to reach more people like you who are ready to go beyond the surface. And comment below, "I heard the call." This phrase is more than a comment. It's a commitment. It's a spiritual cry from those who choose to remember, resist, and reconnect. See you in the next video. Akse, peace, and may your ancestry guide you.